The core of the blaster is this length of plastic pipe. This is 32mm wide Flowplast pipe, and it is 385mm long. Now, to add the body details to this, I have got 2 pieces of 1/2 mil thick plastic card. This goes towards the rear. It includes holes cut in it for what were the ammunition feed ports and the ejection port on the Sterling submachine gun that the blaster was based off, and still appear on the top. And then this is a plain section which goes front and will have some ribbing placed around it. Now, to get these onto the pipe, they need bending into shape, and I find the easiest way to do that is to roll them up and then actually stuff them inside the pipe and leave them for a few hours. That gives them a bit of a curve and makes them far easier to glue to the pipe when you're ready. This is the body of the blaster with the plastic card now wrapped around it. As you can see, it's not fully even. That doesn't matter because we'll sort any imperfections out later. Now, after I wrapped the plastic card around and used super glue to fix it in place, I also wrapped some tape around and then left it for a while just to let the glue cure properly. And next we're going to add the tapered muzzle to the end of this. I use a 100ml measuring cone to make the front of the blaster. This is relatively soft plastic, so it's quite easy to work with. And to turn it in to the front of the blaster, I remove this disc-shaped base at the bottom so that the end is still closed, and cut down the length so that its widest diameter matches the diameter of the main body of the blaster. Then I'll drill a small hole in the end to represent the muzzle itself. So here we have the muzzle. As you can see, the base has been removed, as the cone has been cut down. I've also sanded down the outside to remove all trace of the measurement markings, and drilled a small hole in the front to represent the actual muzzle of the gun, and this will now just be glued directly to the front of the blaster body. With the muzzle glued in place, I'm now going to look at the ribs around the front end of the blaster, and for those I've just got 16 strips of plastic card, 2mm thick plastic card. I'm going to glue those around the body of the blaster so that there's about 10mm between the start of the taper and where the ribbing will start, and you'll see I've drawn a line around to mark out where that's going to be. So here we have the barrel ribbing done, just glued on. I could use plastic glue for that section because I was gluing plastic card to plastic card. I didn't need super glue. And with the muzzle and barrel complete, I'll now move to the back of the blaster and I'll do the end cap. The end cap is made from these 3 pieces of plastic. I've got a short piece of plastic pipe. This is slightly wider than the pipe used for the main body because it's going to fit around it. Then I've got 2 plastic card discs, a 2mm thick part that will just sit on the end, and then a 1/2mm thick part that will be aligned, well, placed in the middle, aligned like that for the detail. Now, this pipe doesn't fit neatly around the body of the blaster. It leaves a slight gap. So to make it fit properly, I have glued 4 small strips of 1mm thick plastic card around the body. And this allows me to slide it on and get a better grip. Of course, it'll leave a gap once it's glued, but that will be dealt with later using some filling material. With the end cap glued in place, it's time to add the Sterling Sling swivel. I make that out some bits of plastic card and a short length of thick wire. I've used wire from a coat hanger, but any 2 to 3 millimeter thick bits of wire will do. I make a channel in which the wire sling swivel will fit out of 2 millimeter thick plastic card, and then this can just be dropped straight into it, like so. And then I've got a piece of 1 millimeter thick plastic card which will be glued over the top to seal it shut, and I've sanded down the edges ever so slightly to smooth them off. Depending on the fit of the actual wire swivel, you may find it rattles and slides about, so if that proves to be problematic for you, then just a bit of super glue will hold it in place nicely. With the sling swivel now glued in place, it's time to move on to the 2 stock catches that are at the rear of the blaster. These I make from 3 pieces of plastic card, and these are simply glued on top of one another to form the shape of the catch. And this is one I've done earlier. As you see, I make 2 which are the same but mirrored, and I file down the top of these to make it diagonal, because that makes it a bit easier to then be able to glue it on about there. And for a bit of extra strength, I will drill and pin this. Here we have the 2 stock retaining latches glued in place, and as I mentioned, I've used a small wire pin to help secure them so they won't just snap off. And later on, using milliput, I'll be building these up into diagonal sections rather than just flat vertical plates. Now though, it's time to move on to the final details of the blaster body. The first of the 3 body details that still needs doing again relates to the stock of the Sterling submachine gun, and this is the switch that would need to be pressed in order to fold up the stock. And there are 2 parts to this. There is a small plastic card channel, which is the housing for the switch, and then the switch itself, again made of plastic card. This uses 2 pieces of 2 millimeter thick plastic card for the main length of the switch, with some small pieces of 1 mil thick placed at the end to widen it out. That can then be glued inside the housing, like so, and in turn this will be glued right at the back of the blaster here. The next of the details is simply a pair of plastic card rectangles with smaller strips of plastic card glued into a couple of the corners, and these will be fixed to the body of the blaster near the rear. Just line that up to show you, about there, and the other one will go underneath so that there's a slight gap between them. Now of course these have to be bent into shape so that they'll fit to the side of the blaster, and for the smaller bits of plastic card, the 2 millimeter thick strips that are glued into the corners, I actually recommend making 1 longer strip and bending that before you cut it. If you try and bend the shorter pieces, they have a horrible tendency to just snap. So those just need gluing on, and then there's just 1 more detail to be done on the main body. The final detail is pictured here. It's located just behind the hole, the rectangular hole with the tab in it on the left hand side of the blaster, where on the Sterling submachine gun the magazine would have fed from, and all it is 2 rectangular pieces of plastic card glued on to form a triangular cross section. Now this is just a frame in the same way as the latches for the stock are, and later on this will be filled in with milliput to make a solid block. But with that in place, we now have the completed body of the blaster, and we can move on to adding the grip and the sight. The grip is cut from 1mm thick plastic card, and I cut out 2 of these shapes, and these will then be connected together, spaced out by some 2mm thick plastic card sections, as you can see I have here, and I've just used some off-cut bits up there to provide a bit of extra support. That is how they will be stuck together. So once we have the 2 halves of the grip body stuck together, you'll see there are still several gaps, and these will be covered up by a length of 1/2mm thick plastic card that I will wrap around the grip from this point here. It'll go all the way around up to that corner just there. Now this might take more than 1 strip of plastic card because of the length, but that's alright, any join can be covered up later. With the plastic card strip now glued around the grip body, it's time to move on to the actual grips themselves, and these I've cut from pieces of 6mm thick balsa wood. You'll notice that they are different. The part for the left hand side has a section cut out of it, which is where the fire selector will go. You'll need to sand a lot of the edges of these down, not only to make them fit, but also to give them the proper curved edge shape of the sterling grips. Another bit of sanding work you'll have to do is on the left hand side grip. You'll see there are 2 pencil lines drawn. Between these we want a curved indentation, which is where your thumb would sit on the grip, providing you're holding it right-handed. And the best way I've found to do this is to get an off-cut section of the pipe you use for the main body, wrap that in sandpaper, and just move it between the 2 lines. The trigger guard is made simply from a piece of brass strip that is 12mm wide, and all I've done is bent this into a curved shape with the very ends kept flat and bent round so that they will fit against the body of the grip, like so, and then that can just be super glued into place. The trigger itself is made from 3 identically cut pieces of plastic card, 2mm thick each, and then these will be just stacked together like so to form a wider solid block, and that will then be glued just in the corner there, and I recommend using a bit of pinning wire to help it stay on. Now you'll notice the way the trigger guard bends in, it might just clip the back of the trigger, so be prepared to have to trim a little bit off to make it fit properly. The fire selector is made from a piece of plastic card, 2mm thick for the switch itself, and then for the actual axis around which the real thing would have turned on the Sterling submachine gun, I just use a small length of balsa wood dowel, and I will then cut down this straight across the middle to make 2 semicircular sections which can be glued either side of the switch prior to it being stuck into place. So here we have the completed grip assembly with the fire selector glued in place. You see it slopes forward, the exact positioning isn't really all that vital. And this is now ready to be glued onto the main body of the blaster. And the alignment, you can see I've drawn a pencil mark on, is at this corner here of the hole on the left hand side. That matches up with the very front of the grip. So it's about there, and I use plastic glue along the top bit here, and then I add some extra super glue to the internal sanded parts of the actual grips just for a bit of extra strength. With the grip glued in place, the blaster's really starting to take shape now. It's obviously meant to be a gun, and you'll be left with 2 holes at the front and the back of the grip, And to cover those, what I use is some extra bits of the 14mm wide, 1/2 mil thick strip used to wrap around the grip, and I just trim them off so they'll fit with a bit of a curve going around, so they cover the holes at the front and the back nicely. And then once those are done, the only aspect of the blaster left to do is the sight and sight rail. The main body of the sight mount is made from a length of balsa wood batten. This will be stuck along the top of the blaster body. I won't glue it directly to the body though, instead it will be spaced off slightly with a couple of pieces of plastic card. This one I'll glue at the very end under the front, this one at the rear, and it will protrude slightly by about 1mm, and this also forms part of what is the rear sight on the Sterling submachine gun, and the two side pieces will be glued to that. The side panels of the rear sight are simply cut from 2mm thick plastic card. I cut 2 identical pieces, and the other one I've already glued onto the back of the sight to show you how it's positioned. If I turn it around, you can see it comes to the rear of the base, so it sticks out just a little past the balsa wood batten rail itself. There are also a pair of foresight elements that are made from 2mm thick bits of plastic card, and I need a total of 4 of these because they will actually be used in pairs on each side, glued together. Though they aren't glued directly together, instead I have some small spacing pieces on, as shown here, and the top spacer is just an offcut of 2mm thick plastic card to give it a gap of 2mm, while the bottom piece is 5mm wide, so this means that when stuck together you'll get a bit of a triangular shape, as you can see here. And then I just glue these onto the front of the rail like so, so that the front of the foresight element is at the front of the wooden batten and the rear of the foresight element is level with the start of the hole on the left hand side of the blaster body. With the foresight elements now glued in place at the front of the sight rail, we have these two sort of skeletal structures, and later on we will deal with these in the same way as the other similar structures, and it will fill in all the gaps with milliput to make them solid. A strip of 1mm thick plastic card is glued to either side of the sight rail mount, like so. You'll notice there's a bit of a gap at each end. It doesn't reach quite the full length of the space between the foresight and rear sight elements. This then has some extra details added to it. A 2mm thick strip of plastic card is used for the base of the detailing, and onto each end of this I glue a length of balsa wood batten. I have a plain rectangular block. You'll notice this is lower profile than the batten used for the main body, and that goes at the back of the strip. At the front I've used a bit from the same batten, but I've sanded down each side to give it a more triangular cross section, and I've also sanded off the front to make it sloping. Then in the gap between these two pieces of balsa wood there's a strip of 1mm thick plastic card that would run the entire length, and that's glued vertically in the middle. Then the rear piece is decorated using 3 smaller pieces of plastic card, spaced evenly out, one in the middle and one at each end. And once again, here's one I made earlier. That's a completed detailing piece, and you'll notice the rear balsa wood batten also has a couple of circles attached. These are just trimmed off bits of plastic tubing. This piece of tubing came from a paintbrush, It was used to protect the bristles. I just cut off some 2mm lengths and glued them into the gaps between those pieces of plastic card. The completed arrangement can then be glued onto the side of the sight rail body. It doesn't quite run the full length. There's a gap at the front and the rear, and it's slightly closer to the rear than it is to the front. And that process is repeated on both sides. The actual sight mounting rail itself is made from 3 strips of 2mm thick plastic card. There's one slightly narrower section and 2 wider sections that each have the sides filed down, so that when they are stacked together back to back, they form a hexagonal cross section. They go on top of this narrower section like so, and then that is just glued onto the top of the blaster about here. Here we have the rail itself glued in place on top of the blaster, and now the only thing left to construct is the sight itself. The body of the sight is made from 3 copper pipe reducers. 2 of these are left as they are, while the third one needs the wider section trimming back. You'll see I put masking tape around this so I can more easily draw a line around the body. And once that's cut back, they'll be arranged end to end like so, and I'll have some narrow plastic pipe which can go through the centre and will help strengthen the bond between the different pieces. So here's the body of the sight put together, and at the moment still basically got a hollow pipe all the way through, so we want to block off the front and the rear. And at the back, it's simply a disc of plastic card that fits inside the pipe reducer like so. And then at the front, I've got another disc that matches the width of the plastic pipe that goes through, but you'll notice there's a hole in it, and that's because that is for part of this sight detail. The single point sight has a red element that pokes through, so I'm going to make that out of a piece of wire with a small piece of balsa wood dowel around it as well. You'll notice there's a hole in the dowel as well. I just line up the 2 holes, poke the wire all the way through, and then glue it on the front of this sight. Just 4 pieces are needed to complete the detailing on the actual sight itself. First of all, I've got what will become the 2 sight adjusting dials for up and down and left and right correction. These are the end caps from cigar tubes, and I'll need to cut them back pretty much all the way up to the ribbed section, because they will then be glued onto the sight body like so, obviously against it, so you can leave little tabs at the side to help steady it a bit if you want, or you could just put them flat. And then there's a disc of plastic card, and this would be what I believe is the brightness control on the single point sight. That's just 2mm thick and will be glued towards the underside of the sight. And finally, we've got the transparent front cover. Now this fits quite well over the end. I'll have to steady it a little bit. Finding this piece was the hardest challenge I faced. I needed one of about the right size and length, and frankly nothing seemed to match until I happened to come across this stuff. This is some sort of spray candy, which I'd never heard of before, and the top of that is about the right size. Basically the only advice I can give you is just keep looking until you find something that fits. So here we have the sight with the details glued onto it, except of course for the transparent end piece. That's not going to be fixed in place until the model is painted. Now there are some slight gaps because I'm gluing to a curved surface. Those can just be filled in with milliput later on. Aside from that, the actual sight is now finished and we just need to mount it on the rest of the blaster. The easiest way to mount the sight onto the blaster is just to use some actual rifle scope mounts. I picked this pair up from eBay for a couple of pounds. They're not very expensive. The varying types out there do mean you may have to do some extra work to get them to fit. For example, although these will fit around the sight quite easily, there's going to be a large gap between the base of the sight and the base of the scope mount, which if it was mounted on the blaster, has it right the way up there. Now we want a gap between the top of this rail and the bottom of the scope of about 5mm. So I'm going to have to trim these down and fill in the holes that are produced on either side. With the scope now mounted on the blaster, I have to add 2 dummy screws that will appear to be holding it in place at the bottom part of the scope mounts. These are made from plastic card for the screw head. You can see this base made from a full circle, and on top of that I placed 2 sort of not quite semicircles. I made this from a circle and then just cut a slot straight down the middle. The base is 2mm thick and the details are 0.5mm thick, and then that will be mounted on a short piece of the same dowel that I used when making the selector switch and also at the front of the sight. And when it's completely assembled, the screw looks like that, and it can simply be glued in place there, and I'll put the second one right there. With the 2 dummy screws in place, it's now time to go over this blaster with milliput, looking for anywhere that there are slight gaps or irregularities, and fill them all in. And also there are the details which are just skeletal structures made of plastic card at the moment, and they need filling in to become solid. Okay, here's the blaster after I've been around it with milliput to fill in all the little gaps that were left during construction. And the 3 key areas are the detail at the left hand side of the body, the foresight, and the stock retaining lugs, where I've built up the solid block out of milliput around the frame of plastic card. And now all that's left to do with this is to paint it. And here we have the finished blaster. Sprayed black, silver fore end, and a slightly darker gunmetal colour to pick out the holes in the body. Same on both sides, with the tiny sight element being bright red inside the transparent cover, which has now been stuck down with PVA glue. Can't use super glue because that would risk misting up the plastic and spoiling the effect. There we have, ready to display or to be added to a costume. Obviously, I don't expect you to be able to reproduce this blaster just having watched this video. So with that in mind, I've also put together an instruction document as I've been going along, which includes the full parts list. It is illustrated throughout. While I've been videoing this, I've been photographing each stage as well. It goes through the whole process. Right the way through to painting, and at the back includes sets of templates for each part. Each template is described. You get the thickness of the plastic card to use, the dimensions. If you can get this on A4 printed out, I think they're about 1:1, so you might just be able to lay them out and copy them, especially useful for parts like this. And there you go. Now this will be going up on my website very shortly. I just need the link back to this video because I mentioned there's a video tutorial in there. So I need to add that, and then this will be online and you can have a go yourself. Thanks for watching and happy building. May the force be with you.